Man, Gino, you're listening to News Radio 1020 KDKA. Thank you very much for being a part of it tonight. Interesting story. Did you see the Post-Gazette today? Emails show the NCAA and Free worked together in Penn State investigation. See, all this time, we all thought, right, that Louis Free got his team together and charged Penn State millions and millions of dollars to do an investigation, and then they completed it, and then they took it and then dumped it at the feet of the NCAA. The NCAA looks at all of this and says, all right, fine. Well, since Penn State's saying that they've done all of these horrible things and they're willing to admit to all of it, then here comes the hammer. Well, that's not exactly the way it went down. Now, according to a lot of emails going back and forth that recent court documents have uncovered, it actually shows that the NCAA and Louis Freeh's firm have had ongoing conversations and communications, not just, hello, how's it going, how are the kids? I mean, I'm talking about involved, detailed presentations back and forth, going all the way back to November of 2011. With us right now on the 84 Lumber Newsline is John Ziegler from FramingPaterno.com. John, welcome to KDK. Good to have you back on.
Robert, always great to talk to you, especially when there's the whiff of vindication in the air.
Isn't that something? I got to tell you, I wasn't expecting to hear that Louis Freeh has been working hand in hand with the NCAA to put all this together in the first place. I wasn't expecting to hear that.
Well, I wasn't expecting to have proof of it, but it's perfectly consistent with what I've been saying all along. And let me explain a little bit further about why this is so important. See, the first most amazing element of what you just described there is that in November and December of 2011, just after Joe Paterno was fired, you have elements of the Penn State Board of Trustees, which is an important element of this, of course, because they're paying the bills and they're the ones trying to justify their firing of Joe Paterno, in collusion with Louis Freeh and the NCAA to punish Penn State. Mm-hmm. Now, why is that timing incredibly important? Jerry Sandusky hasn't even gone to trial yet. Not only has Jerry Sandusky never even gone to trial yet, it's not even close, he hasn't had a preliminary hearing yet. Not only that, but at that time period, Robert, everybody, including Mike McQuarrie and the Office of the Attorney General and even those at Penn State and everyone in the media, thought that the only episode connected to Penn State occurred in March of 2002. It didn't. It occurred in February of 2001. They didn't even know what year they were talking about then, and they're already discussing punishments for Penn State long before Jerry Sandusky ever goes to trial. And if that's not a recipe for a rush to judgment against everybody in this case, I don't know what is.
I am just glad that the litigation is continuing at this point, because if it wouldn't have, then we wouldn't know all that we're learning now, and then ultimately, who knows what there is yet to find out.
Well, I'm understanding there's a lot more emails yet to come. I've been told by a very good source that we're going to see an email from an NCAA official that is rather slanderous to Joe Paterno and maybe even use profanity in relationship to Joe Paterno. That'll excite people, I'm sure. And I agree with you that, you know, this is a situation where the truth has a funny way of coming out. But my concern, Robert, is that people aren't going to put all the pieces together here, because this is a very complicated puzzle. It's not that complicated when you've followed it closely, like a lot of people have, and people who follow my website, FramingPaterno.com, they're all going, wow, this all fits perfectly with what I have been saying and some others have been saying since day one. I think the most important part of this, Robert, and since this is such an incredibly complicated situation with regard to the details, and we can't get deep into the details, although I'd be glad to, because we don't have time. I think the number one thing that has caused people to misunderstand what happened in this case, and I'm talking about everybody, especially in the news media, is that people have done a very poor job of understanding what every entity's incentives are. And in fact, this whole case is run by a set of upside-down and misunderstood incentives. I'm talking from the Attorney General's office to the media to the Board of Trustees to the Free Group to the NCAA and even to the Paterno family. Everybody's incentives are vastly different than what they're perceived to be, and that's why people don't understand what really did and didn't happen here.
Yeah, and what we don't have are the media, the NCAA, Louis Free, and Penn State. None of those were interested in getting down to the truth.
Well, that's a great point. And, for people who don't remember who I am, I have no connection to Penn State. I'm not in a commercial endeavor. I've done a movie on this, a book on this. There's more content at framingpaterno.com than there probably is anywhere else, and it's all free. I've destroyed my career over this because my pursuit has been the actual truth, not a truth that makes me feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. In fact, this is a truth, my truth, what I believe happened here, Robert, is a truth I didn't want to come to. I fought it for over a year, as you well know. But the facts led me there. And the first misunderstood incentive is that of the media. People still, although maybe talk radio listeners don't, people still think the news media's job is to tell the truth. They don't understand. Their job is to find a narrative or a story that on that day will help them keep their jobs.
Right.
And there was one narrative that was set in 2 days in November of 2011. That was a narrative that was ridiculous. Let's review this narrative again one more time. The narrative 3 years ago at this time was that Mike McQueary had seen Jerry Sandusky anally raping a 10-year-old boy, told Joe Paterno about it, never acted like he saw a crime for over 10 years, and Joe Paterno and Penn State either did nothing about it or covered it up. That is ridiculous on its face at every level, and I have spent 3 years investigating this, and it didn't happen that way. There's not a shred of evidence it happened that way. There's a mountain of evidence that it didn't. And this is the narrative that got created, and it got accepted by entities like the Penn State Board of Trustees that people perceived incorrectly must know what they're talking about. Penn State wouldn't plead guilty to something if it wasn't true. They wouldn't fire Joe Paterno if they didn't know Jerry Sandusky was guilty. They wouldn't fire Graham Spanier if they didn't know that Jerry Sandusky was guilty. Well, guess what, folks? They didn't know because they were in a panic because the news media had been calling them pedophile protectors, and ESPN was setting up that Saturday football game live on ESPN against Nebraska. Joe Paterno's last home game entry had just broken the NCAA win record as a pep rally for a pedophile protector. And these 32 members of the Board of Trustees at Penn State, led by the governor, and your listeners know well about who Tom Corbett is and who he isn't and what he said last week about Joe Paterno probably should have been fired, probably not been fired. Those were his words. This is the guy who pulled the trigger that night in a conference call where there was no vote, there was no debate, and there were no facts. And that was the start of the avalanche of injustice, which is still continuing today. And I just hope, as we learn what really did not happen, Robert, that people put all the pieces together instead of just the pieces that make them feel comfortable about themselves.
John Ziegler is with us. He's with framingpaterno.com. Great website to go to find out more and more about what has taken place since, and even long before as well, the news of Jerry Sandusky and his grand jury presentment that was made. More with John coming up in a moment. If you have any questions, you're welcome to call in and be a part of this as well. 866-391-1020. Oh, look at that. Clint, you did it again. How does he do this all the time? It's 1020, everybody. I'm Mangino. You're listening to KDKA. With me right now on the 84 Lumber News Line is John Ziegler from framingpaterno.com. News out today that the NCAA and Louis Free worked hand in hand. In fact, one quote I have here from Senator Jake Corman, Republican from Center County, saying that there clearly is a significant amount of communication between Free and the NCAA that goes way beyond merely providing information. I'd call it coordination. John, coordination to what and against who?
Well, he also goes on to say to a predetermined result, which is incredibly important here. And it's also important to point out this proves Louis Freeh lied. Because Louis Freeh was, and by the way, Penn State lied, and the NCAA lied, because they're all on record saying that this didn't happen. Now, why did they want a predetermined result? And what result was that? That result was to blame Penn State, Joe Paterno, and the administrators for the crimes, the alleged crimes at that time, because he hadn't even gone to trial yet, of Jerry Sandusky. Why did they want to do this? Well, this is what I talk about when I'm referring to misunderstood upside-down incentives. People think that the Penn State Board of Trustees would be entrusted with defending Penn State, right? Right. Especially if they were innocent. That would be a logical thing to think, and that is the biggest misconception in the entire case, because from that, everything else flows. What you need to understand is that group, the Board of Trustees of Penn State, were not only a bunch of incompetent wimps who melted like a candle in a blast furnace during that first full week of November in 2011 when the media firestorm started. But once they fired Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier, the president of the university, a well-respected guy, once they do that, now they need vindication for that decision. Because if it turns out that Paterno didn't do anything wrong, and God forbid, if it turns out Sandusky's not guilty, my goodness, they're completely screwed. They look like the biggest idiots that have ever walked the planet. And so they pay Louis Freeh $6.5 million, a professional whore, in my opinion, and I think the factual record backs me up, who comes in and gives whoever's paying him what they want to hear. And, of course, the NCAA has a bizarre incentive here because they're seeing an opportunity with the media giving them a hurricane wind at their back. They have a chance to exert their authority in a way they haven't been able to do for years. And I believe further emails are going to prove, Mangino, that there was personal animus against Penn State, against Joe Paterno. So everybody's incentives here are upside down. The truth has nothing to do with it. It's about the Penn State Board of Trustees covering their ass for a horrendous decision that even Tom Corbett now says they probably shouldn't have done in firing Joe Paterno, and everything flows from that.
Let's talk about Corbett and this statement about the Penn State probably should not have fired Joe Paterno. Why even bother saying this now?
I was as baffled as anybody. I laughed when I heard that. I thought, wow, it might have gotten him a couple of votes if he had said it 3 days prior instead of after the election. My theory on this, Robert, is this is one of those situations where the truth just happened to sneak out by accident. I think he had been campaigning for so long, it was over. He knows his career is over. It just kind of came out. Even if you read the statement, it's almost like he tries to backtrack illogically after saying it, but he should have been suspended. I don't even understand what that means. But the reality is that statement is the smoking gun of this whole deal. He is the guy who fired Joe Paterno. That's not a matter of opinion.
Why are you making it so personal that he is the guy?
Because, first of all, he's the governor of the state. You have to remember what's going on. It is very well documented that Tom Corbett, who never attended these Board of Trustees meetings, changed his schedule, changed the timing of the indictment to come in. He took out rooms at the Nittany Lion Inn, the State College, so that he could be there on site when the explosion occurred. He bragged to people after it happened. He told that conference call, remember the child in the shower, which he then later denied ever having said, even though he said it at a press conference on video in front of the whole world. He changed his mind on that, Mangino, because I think he got new information about that 10-year-old child and realized that he didn't want to hitch his wagon to that. But he's the guy who's telling all these members of the Board of Trustees, most of whom have no clue what's happening. So they're in the middle of this firestorm. The ship is sinking, and Corbett, the governor, is telling them, look, my office, the Attorney General, tells me what's really going on here. Of course they're going to believe Tom Corbett. They all do. do what he told them to do. When he says, remember the child in the shower, it was he might as well have been pulling the trigger on not only the firing of Joe Paterno, but for all intents and purposes, the death of Joe Paterno. He's got the blood on his hands, and for him to now say he probably shouldn't have done it, that says everything.
John Ziegler is with us from FramingPaterno.com. We'll talk more with him about the NCAA and Louis Freeh working together to create this investigation going all the way back to November of 2011. More coming up in a moment. Has your view about Joe Paterno, Penn State, and the entire situation up there changed at all over the years? For a lot of people, they were firmly set on the guilt of everyone, the institution, Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky, all of them. And now we're finding out there's reasons to doubt all the beliefs that many people have held. Are you one of them? 866-391-1020, Dollar Bank Instant Access at KDKA.com. 1033, I'm Mangino. Great having you here. Here's the phone number, 866-391-1020, Dollar Bank Instant Access at KDKA.com. John, considering what the NCAA has done in punishing Penn State, I want to go back to the Paterno thing. Now that Governor Corbett is saying that Paterno probably shouldn't have been fired, maybe suspension at most, do you see that there's more reason to believe now than before that the NCAA may restore victories back to Joe Paterno and actually restore everything back to the university again?
Robert, I think I'm pretty good at telling the future in this case because, as humbly as I can possibly say it, I have predicted almost everything that's happened pretty darn correctly, and I've not been wrong about anything. At least no one's been able to prove me wrong about anything. I am now positive, and I don't know what the timing is going to be, but it could be fairly soon. I am positive that Joe Paterno is going to get his wins back. That is not even a question in my mind. And it's probably now the only question I have there is that going to happen because the NCAA completely folds in the face of these lawsuits and says, uncle? Now, the problem with the uncle theory is I do think that the Paterno family is going to need an apology for that to occur. But the revelations of the last week, Robert, might be enough to force the NCAA into an apology. So they may have enough leverage now to get that apology plus the wins, plus whatever else it is else that Sue Paterno wants. I interviewed Franco Harris just the other day on my weekend talk show, and he said this is basically all up to Sue at this point. What does she want? And I don't have an answer to that, but my guess is it's an apology, some other elements of the lawsuit, and obviously the wins back because of their symbolic value. I also believe that eventually, certainly in my daughter's lifetime, hopefully in my lifetime, Joe Paterno's statue is going to be back somewhere on the Penn State grounds. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. However, I'm concerned that as I see this story developing, I think that what's going to occur here is that once Joe Paterno is made whole, and he will be made whole at least as far as Penn Staters are concerned. The media is never going to fully accept that. Some of them might do a small mea culpa like Bob Costas did, but Joe Paterno is going to be made whole. My concern, Robert, is that that's going to stunt any ability to actually get to the real truth of this matter, because we have this bizarre set of incentives that I referred to in the first half hour here, where you have the Paterno family and many, but not all, of Penn State supporters having this very strange and, to me, odd incentive where they want Jerry Sandusky to be guilty because they've been already accused of being pedophile protectors once by the news media. They don't want to go through that again. They want this to be finally over with. This has been a nightmare. I get all that, folks. It's been a nightmare on my life, too. Believe me, I didn't ask for this. I have no connection to Penn State at all whatsoever. I just wanted the truth of this matter, and I think I found the truth, Robert, but the problem is this is a truth that no one has an incentive to embrace, ironically, even though I'm bearing good news, because I don't believe anybody was sexually assaulted in this case. And you know what the most amazing part is, Robert? Not only am I positive of that, this isn't even close. When people look back at this case years from now, when I am vindicated, and I will be vindicated, they're going to laugh except for the tragedy of this. They're going to laugh at how preposterous this entire case was from A to Z. And I just hope that when people look at the math here and they see how corrupt the Office of the Attorney General was with their frivolous indictments of the Penn State Three, with how bad the media was, how gutless the Board of Trustees was, how corrupt Louis Freeh was, how corrupt the NCAA was, when all those entities are controlling what happened here, and these most recent communications prove there was a rush to judgment beyond all comprehension, that they had a predetermined outcome. When people look at all this, when they realize how much garbage went into this investigation, how in the world could all those people have gotten the right answer on Jerry Sandusky in 2 days? In 2 days. That's what we're being asked to believe. It's ridiculous. The whole thing is ridiculous, and I just hope people don't give up on the truth simply because Joe Paterno rightfully gets his wins back, which is going to happen.
No, I think that it's probably going to work out that way because the passion and the drive is more about Joe Paterno than it is about finding absolute truth. But for people who are listening, many are just, I'm sure, shocked, can't believe they're hearing somebody on the air that's defending Jerry Sandusky and saying that he is not what he's been found guilty of. There was a time that you believed that he was.
Yes.
As a quick reminder, before I go to calls, because I have a phone bank full of them, I want to be able to get to them. As a quick reminder, if you can give it to me in less than 2 minutes or so, what it was that transformed you from going from believing he was the monster that everybody listening believes that he is to where you think now that he never sexually assaulted anyone.
I interviewed him in prison for 3 hours, assuming he was guilty as hell. I did so purely because I wanted to get to the truth of the Joe Paterno Penn State matter. When I got out of the state prison after recording it against the rules of the state prison system in Pennsylvania, my head exploded because my heart and head was telling me my gut, no way, no possible way, but I still believed it. And I wasn't going to go out on a limb and destroy the effort to try to get justice for Joe Paterno by being misperceived about as being a defender of Jerry Sandusky. So when I went on the Today Show with Matt Lauer, I basically said, yeah, I think Jerry's probably guilty, but it might be not the same as what people think, something to that effect. Matt Lauer forced it out of me, whatever. I spent the next year plus, Robert, investigating this case from an entirely different perspective. And I went back to prison and interviewed Jerry and Dottie Sandusky together. And Dottie and I went on the Today Show with Matt Lauer a year later and did the whole interview thing again. And what I found, Robert, is no one checked the math on this story. Everyone presumed the math they were given on November 5th, 2011 made perfect sense. No one had the incentive to check it. I checked it. It doesn't even come close. And you know what? No one close to this case believes he's guilty. No one close to him believes he's guilty. People around him are positive he's innocent. People in the prison are positive he's innocent. This whole case is ridiculous on its face.
How is it then that we even got to this point if it's ridiculous on its face value? How do we get here?
Here's what happened, I believe. I believe that Aaron Fisher was molested by his stepfather, who was recently arrested on 109 counts of child molestation, including against his own children in the states of Pennsylvania and Georgia. I believe that was projected onto Jerry with the help of a therapist. I believe that Jerry, in a perfect storm, because he's a horrible talker and knew he had done nothing wrong, he engages in a couple of interviews that he should never have gone to. His lawyer told him not to. I believe the OAG bought into Aaron Fisher's story, and then when Mike McQuarrie fell in their lap, they thought, Eureka, we've hit the gold mine. Everything flows from that. Joe Paterno's age works against him. I think he had his recollection of a 10-year-old conversation misrefreshed by either his son Scott or by Mike McQuarrie, and I think that at that point the OAG says, we got Penn State, and I think Corbett goes after Spanier. I think everybody goes for their piece of meat. I think that at the time that Jerry got arrested, there were only two accusers claiming any sort of a sex act. Both had the same therapist, Robert, the same one, and they both had huge problems with their story. But when Joe Paterno gets fired on November 9, 2011, The next morning in the Business Insider, there's a headline, Penn State on the hook for $100 million. At that point, all bets are off. The snowball is down the mountain. It's an avalanche. The media has decided Jerry's a monster. He can't defend himself. He butchers the Bob Costas interview, and it's all she wrote from there.
And everybody was
had an incentive. They'll check the math. I did. Unfortunately, it didn't add up. I wish it had, because I didn't want this more than anyone else did. But the truth is the truth, and it's got to matter.
And everybody was in CYA mode. Penn State Board of Trustees, CYA, everybody was at a point to where, okay, this is the way that it is. The narrative is indefensible. I mean, you can't go against it. And so now we have to figure out the best way of creating a cover and dealing with it. So Penn State says, Louis Free, come up with what it needs to be in order to say, yes, we're guilty of it. We'll just go ahead and take our lumps and we'll throw ourselves on the mercy of the system. And then the NCAA recognizes that, goes along with it as well. And then it isn't until we have these lawsuits that are filed by Corman and Treasurer Rob McCord and the Paternos that more and more is discovered till ultimately today we're looking at the NCAA and Louis Free working in tandem since November 2011.
Robert, it's really well said. I just want to add one thing, though, because this is not a conspiracy.
Okay.
And what you're saying, I don't think is really a conspiracy, but I think there's an important element here. Because the media is blowing this wind at everybody's back, they all think they're doing the right thing. So it's not a matter of them thinking. The people that are doing this aren't thinking that they're doing anything nefarious. They think they're fighting child sex abuse and making sure that the right people are punished for doing horrible things. That's what they've rationalized in their brain. And so everybody is just doing this naturally. It's organic.
But I'll go along with that 100%. I completely agree with that. I mean, everybody looks at this and it says, we want horrible monsters that would do wicked, terrible things that children dealt with and prosecuted and, pumped daylight down to them in prison. And anybody that would allow that to happen needs to be punished as well. So I would agree. It's all about the right intentions and wanting to preserve children and protect children. But it wasn't done with thoughtful deliberation. It was done with a rush to judgment, and going back all the way to the very beginning, going back all the way when people were ready to take Joe Paterno, who was commended for what he did and how he handled it at the early stages of the release back in November of 2010 to within just weeks, if not days. It goes from that to then he needs to be kicked out and needs to be in prison next to Jerry Sandusky and is as horrible as he is and a sexual predator, molester, defender.
People don't use their brains when it comes to child sex abuse. Their brains blow up. I understand that. I have a 2-year-old child myself. But you know what? Logic, facts, and truth have got to still matter, and they didn't in this case because everybody's brains blew up.
All right, let me say this. I have not read. I mean, I could have access to it because you put everything up on framingpaterno.com. I have not read everything to get me to where you are on Jerry Sandusky. I'm going to straight up and tell you that. I'm not where you are on that. But short of Jerry, when it comes to Joe Paterno and Penn State and what's happened with the NCAA, I'm with you all the way there. Let me pause here for a moment, and I want to get to as many calls as we possibly can. John Ziegler is with us from framingpaterno.com. We'll come back with more in a moment. News Radio 1020, KDKA. All right, I'm Mangino with me, John Ziegler from framingpaterno.com. To your calls, Mark in Charlotte, North Carolina. Good evening. You're on KDKA.
Good evening, gentlemen. How are you?
Doing well. What's on your mind, Mark?
Well, the main hypocrisy that I see right now with the NCAA is that the Free report was based on 17 emails, that the people who wrote them were never interviewed about what the content meant. They were not asked, what does this mean? They did not ask who actually wrote this, who are they talking about. Free based most of his report on those 17 emails. Okay. So now we have 400 or so of them coming out, thanks to Jay Corman, the NCAA and Penn State says, well, these are selective and you really can't make a judgment on any of them.
That's incredibly well said, because one of the things I noticed today, Mangino, was how hilarious is it when you look back at the free emails and how incredibly vague and really proving of nothing they are. When you compare them to the emails we now have, they're all very clear-cut. It's very obvious who's talking about whom, what they're saying. There's nothing vague about it at all. They really make the free emails look ridiculous, don't they?
Yeah, Mark, excellent observation. Thank you very much for calling in with it. John in Greensburg, good evening. You're on KDKA.
Thank you for taking my call.
Thank you for calling.
Hey, just as an intellectual exercise, humor me for just a moment here.
Okay.
Think of some heinous crime and then ask me if I've ever committed it.
What's the point you're trying to make? Did you think that Jerry Sandusky would be much more...
Sandusky's answer when he was asked point blank by Costas, are you sexually attracted to young boys? Now, there's only one answer to that if you're innocent. That answer would be no. He said, no, am I sexually attracted to young boys? Well, let me think now about how I want to answer that. I like young boys. He's guilty of sin.
All right. It's a great point. John Ziegler, how would you respond to that?
I would respond to that by saying when I heard that was the first time I thought Jerry might be innocent. Because I thought... Really? First of all, yeah, and here's why. This is really important. So give me a second here.
Okay.
When I first heard that, I thought, well, first of all, it's important to point out, he did say, no, I'm not sexually attracted to young boys. That's important. But I'll be the first to admit that was a horrendous answer. So horrendous, Mangino, there is not a chance in the world that that's the guy who got away with this behavior for 30 or 40 years in the positions that he held. Impossible. And when I went to interview him, I learned this is the way this guy talks. He won't tell you what time of day it is unless he has 3 watches. And his wife, I have on tape, Dottie, laughing. I have her on tape laughing about how frustrating it has always been for almost 50 years for her to talk to him in these types of situations, because that's the way he speaks. He is a weird talker, and that was a classic circumstance of how in the world do you wash that answer with a guy who was the master liar, the master manipulator? I would suggest to your caller, if you're really guilty, you do answer that differently. You say no way because you're ready for it. You've done it a million times, and your knee-jerk reaction is that's outrageous. Jerry knew he wasn't guilty, so he goes, well, let me think about that. I never thought about it before because I'm not guilty, but no, I'm not sexually attracted to young boys. Makes a hell of a lot more sense with innocence than it does with guilt.
But as a communicator, if he communicates that poorly, how has he been able to be such an effective coach for all the years that he was at Penn State?
You know, that's an interesting question, and I've actually coached football, Mangino. I've actually written a book about spending a year with a high school football team. Football coaches are an odd breed. I don't know that this is the right terminology, but in some ways they're autistic. They're incredibly proficient in very micro-focused circumstances of their lives. And in other areas, they're complete numbskulls. And that, I mean, I've seen that from top to bottom of the coaching profession. And I think that Jerry qualifies as this. Jerry is a very naive person who is not a very good speaker, but I'll tell you what, he's a hell of a letter writer. And he's such a good letter writer, and it got him in trouble in the trial because some people actually think that a letter he wrote to one of the accusers was somehow the best evidence against him, which, by the way, I would suggest to people, if that's the best you got in a case like this, that's pretty pathetic.
Okay, I've got 20 seconds. What do you think is the next shoe to drop?
There's going to be more emails, and I think they're going to be more embarrassing to the NCAA. And I think the NCAA is going to eventually have to cave because they don't want Mark Emmert to testify, and Joe Paterno will be made whole.
John Ziegler with FramingPaterno.com. John, great having you on this evening. I'm looking forward to having you on next time news breaks over this.
Awesome. Thanks, Robert, for letting me speak the truth.
Absolutely. John Ziegler with us from FramingPaterno.com. Hey, go read for yourself. That's all I can suggest. Go read for yourself.